She was 23 years old when this photograph was taken in the spring of 1912. Within 6 months, the emperor would be dead. Japan would have a new ruler, and this woman, standing quietly at the edge of the frame, would begin to slowly disappear from history. But the secret she wore on her robe that day, that would survive for 111 years before anyone noticed it shouldn't exist. This 1912 formal imperial portrait sat in the Japanese Imperial Household Agency archives for over a century. It was reproduced in 17 major publications, displayed in 3 international exhibitions, examined by hundreds of historians, curators, and scholars from Tokyo to London to New York. But in 2019, when a textile preservation specialist applied new digital enhancement software to a high-resolution scan of the original glass plate negative, she noticed something that made her hands go still over the keyboard. Woven into the silk of that young woman's robe was a symbol that, according to every law of the Meiji era, should not have been possible to wear in the emperor's presence. A symbol that was, by imperial decree, absolutely forbidden. By minute 4, you'll see exactly what symbol was hidden in the fabric, and understand why wearing it could have meant political execution during the Meiji era. By minute 15, you'll discover who this woman actually was, and why every trace of her was systematically erased from imperial records after this photograph was taken. And by minute 32, you'll meet the woman who believes she is this mystery figure's great-great-granddaughter, and see the textile fragment she's kept hidden for decades that may prove the connection. What historians found woven into this silk isn't just a pattern. It's a confession that was never meant to be discovered. What you're about to discover is a story about the lengths that powerful institutions will go to control their own narrative, and the even more extraordinary lengths that one woman may have gone to preserve her truth when she was forbidden to speak it. In Meiji-era Japan, every thread of an imperial garment was regulated, every symbol carried meaning, every color required permission. So when this woman walked into the imperial palace wearing a pattern that combined the imperial chrysanthemum with the crest of the emperor's oldest enemy, she was either making a deliberate statement or revealing a secret that could have destroyed her. Let me show you exactly what she wore. And then let me show you what happened to her after this photograph was taken. The photograph measures 12 by 16 inches, printed from a glass plate negative that survives in the Imperial Household Agency collection. It shows 9 members of the imperial family arranged in the formal reception room of the Tokyo Imperial Palace, positioned before a backdrop featuring the chrysanthemum throne emblem, the 16-petaled golden flower that has symbolized the Japanese emperor for over 1,000 years. In the center, seated, is Emperor Meiji himself, 60 years old in this image, his health visibly declining, his beard now fully white, the man who had transformed Japan from a feudal nation into a modern power, the man who would be dead within months. To his right sits Empress Shokin, her hair styled in the formal Takashimada arrangement, her silk robes layered in the 12-layer Juniato style reserved for the highest-ranking imperial women. Her face carries the composed dignity expected of an empress. Standing behind them are Crown Prince Yashihito, who would become Emperor Taisho within months, and his wife, Crown Princess Sadako. They are positioned precisely according to protocol, their postures rigid with formality. The younger generation fills the wings of the composition. Princes in military dress uniforms with medals gleaming. Princesses in formal court robes, each face a study in practiced stillness. And there, positioned at the left edge of the frame, standing slightly apart from the central family group, is the woman we're here to discuss. She appears to be in her early 20s. Her face is composed, almost expressionless in the manner expected of imperial photography. Her hands are folded precisely at her waist. Her posture is perfect. She looks, at first glance, like any other member of the imperial household. But her robe is different from every other garment in this photograph. At first glance, her kimono appears appropriate for a formal imperial occasion. It's silk, clearly expensive, dyed in the deep purple-black color called Koki Murasaki, a shade that was restricted by law to the highest ranks of nobility. The cut and layering follow court protocol. She wears the appropriate number of underrobes visible at the collar and hem. But textile historians who examined high-resolution scans of this photograph began to notice inconsistencies. The fabric of her obi sash, the wide belt that wraps around the waist, featured a pattern that didn't match any known imperial textile from the period. The design woven into the lower hem of her outer robe contained motifs that seemed, at first glance, to be standard imperial chrysanthemum variations. They weren't. When Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a textile preservation specialist at the Kyoto National Museum, applied computational photography enhancement to the original glass plate in 2019, the pattern resolved into something that should not have been possible. Something that made her immediately contact 3 separate historians before she showed anyone else what she'd found. The pattern woven into the young woman's obi sash and robe hem contained 2 interlocked symbols. The first was a chrysanthemum, but not the 16-petaled imperial chrysanthemum reserved for the emperor alone. This was a 14-petaled variant, a version that, according to Meiji-era sumptuary laws, was assigned to specific cadet branches of the imperial family and could only be worn with explicit permission. But it was the second symbol that made Dr. Tanaka stop breathing. Intertwined with the chrysanthemum petals, woven so subtly that it could only be seen under digital enhancement, was the 3-leafed hollyhock. The Tokugawa Ai, the family crest of the Tokugawa shoguns, who had ruled Japan for 265 years, before being overthrown by Emperor Meiji's forces in 1868. The hollyhock crest had been banned from imperial presence after the Meiji Restoration. Displaying it in the emperor's household would have been an act of political defiance bordering on treason. Wearing it into the imperial palace in a formal photograph, standing feet away from Emperor Meiji himself, it would have been unthinkable. Unless this woman had a reason. Unless she was making a statement. Unless she was hiding something in plain sight that she knew might never be discovered. When researchers examined the back of the original mounted photograph, they found 3 notations written in brush calligraphy. The first was a date, 3rd month, 45th year of Meiji, March 1912. The second was a list of names corresponding to each figure in the photograph. Every name matched imperial records exactly, except one. The name written for the young woman in the controversial robe was Kazuko no Miya, Princess Kazuko. But there is no Princess Kazuko in any surviving genealogy of the Meiji imperial family. The third notation was written in smaller characters at the bottom edge, partially faded but still legible. This copy for safekeeping, others withdrawn. Others withdrawn. Who ordered the withdrawal? Why was this copy preserved for safekeeping when others were destroyed? And who was Princess Kazuko, if she was a princess at all? A woman wearing a forbidden symbol, a name that doesn't exist in official records, a photograph ordered withdrawn with only one copy secretly preserved. Finding answers would require going beyond imperial archives, into private collections, court records, and the sealed files of the Meiji government. What we found there suggests that this wasn't an accident. This was a message, and someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure it was never received. Investigating the Japanese imperial family is unlike researching any other historical subject in the world. The Imperial Household Agency maintains strict control over imperial archives. Many records from the Meiji and Taisho periods remain sealed to outside researchers even today. Cultural norms around discussing the imperial family, particularly anything that might suggest scandal or controversy, create additional barriers that Western researchers often underestimate. When Dr. Tanaka's discovery began circulating among academic historians in late 2019, it sparked a coordinated research effort unlike anything seen in Japanese textile history. A team of researchers from Kyoto University, the University of Tokyo, and the National Museum of Japanese History began cross-referencing every available source. Court diaries, diplomatic records, newspaper archives, private family collections, and the records of the major textile workshops that supplied the imperial household. They were looking for any mention of a Princess Kazuko, any record of a young woman connected to both the imperial family and the Tokugawa bloodline, any explanation for how a forbidden symbol could have appeared in the most formal photograph of the Meiji era. The first breakthrough came not from imperial archives, but from the private papers of a textile merchant family in Kyoto who had supplied silk to the palace for generations. The Kawashima family has produced silk textiles in Kyoto for over 200 years. Their archive, maintained in a climate-controlled facility since 1985, contains ledgers documenting every major commission the family workshop fulfilled from 1854 to 1952. In February 2020, historian Dr. Hiroshi Yamamoto gained access to the Meiji-era ledgers specifically covering imperial commissions. In the volume covering 1911 to 1912, he found an entry dated November 1911, 4 months before the imperial photograph was taken. The entry reads, "Special Commission for the Household of His Highness, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Koki Murasaki outer robe with Juni Hito under layers, 14-petal kiku variation with concealed secondary motif as specified. Pattern approved by household official. Rush completion requested. Delivery to Akasaka by 20th day of 12th month." The entry was unusual in several ways. First, the commission came not from the Imperial Household Agency directly, but from the Household of His Highness, a vaguer designation that could refer to any prince's personal household rather than the central imperial administration. Second, the phrase "concealed secondary motif as specified" indicated that the hidden Tokugawa pattern was intentional, designed to be subtle, designed to escape notice. Third, a note in different handwriting, added later, states, "Full payment received in cash, no receipt issued per request, this commission not to be discussed." No receipt issued. Not to be discussed. Someone had paid extra for secrecy, and someone in the Kawashima family had later felt compelled to add a warning. Dr. Yamamoto's research into the phrase, "household of His Highness," led him to a specific address. The Akasaka Palace subsidiary residence, assigned to Prince Fushimi Sadenaru. Prince Fushimi was a cousin of Emperor Meiji who had advocated for political reconciliation with Tokugawa descendants during the 1890s and early 1900s. His household records, partially preserved in the National Archives of Japan, show a pattern of private commissions that bypassed standard imperial protocols. But the most troubling detail wasn't the destination. It was the timing. November 1911 was a period of intense concern about Emperor Meiji's health. The succession question was suddenly urgent. Factional politics within the imperial household had become acute as different branches positioned themselves for influence in the coming transition. If someone connected to Prince Fushimi's household was commissioning a robe that combined imperial symbols with Tokugawa heritage, and doing so in secret, with cash payment and no documentation, it suggested that someone was preparing to make a statement. During one of the most politically sensitive moments in modern Japanese history. The later notation, "this commission not to be discussed," appears to have been added in 1912 or 1913 based on ink analysis. By that time, Emperor Meiji was dead, Emperor Taisho had ascended the throne, and the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Whatever the robe was meant to communicate, someone had decided it was now too dangerous to acknowledge. In 2018, the Japanese government declassified a collection of administrative documents from the Imperial Household Agency covering the period 1912 to 1926, the entire Taisho era. Among thousands of bureaucratic records, a team of researchers found a folder labeled Photographic Protocol Review, 1912-1913. Inside was a memorandum dated August 1912, 1 month after Emperor Meiji's death, ordering a comprehensive review of all formal imperial photographs taken in the final year of the Meiji era. The memo was signed by 3 senior officials of the Imperial Household Ministry, including Tanaka Mitsuaki, who would become one of the most powerful figures in the agency during the 1910s and 1920s. The memorandum stated, "All formal portraits are to be examined for compliance with protocol. Any images containing inappropriate symbolism, irregular dress, or unauthorized persons are to be withdrawn from archives and marked for restricted access. No copies of withdrawn images are to be distributed. Related negatives are to be secured." The memo didn't specify what inappropriate symbolism meant, but attached to the memorandum was a handwritten list of photograph reference numbers. The 1912 family portrait was on that list. And next to the reference number, someone had written a single notation. Lady of the left, robe examined, recommend withdrawal. Someone had noticed, someone had seen the symbol, and someone had begun the process of making sure no one else ever would. By the summer of 1912, someone had noticed. The forbidden symbol woven into her robe had been identified. A formal recommendation to withdraw the photograph had been made. The machinery of Imperial image control was beginning to move. But the photograph wasn't destroyed. One copy was preserved for safekeeping. And the woman herself, the mysterious Princess Kazuko, whose name appears in no official genealogy, she didn't disappear immediately. She remained in Imperial photographs for several more months. Which means between August 1912 and her eventual erasure, something else happened. Someone protected her. Someone delayed the inevitable. To understand who and why, we need to go back further, to the question that the Imperial Household Agency was most afraid of anyone asking. Who was this woman and where did she come from? Tanaka Mitsuaki was 57 years old in 1912. A career bureaucrat who had risen through the Imperial Household Ministry over 3 decades. His family had been minor retainers of the Satsuma domain, one of the clans that had led the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868. For men like Tanaka, the Meiji government's legitimacy rested on a simple premise. The Tokugawa era had been a dark period of military dictatorship that had suppressed the rightful rule of the emperor. The Meiji Restoration hadn't been a revolution, it had been a restoration of the natural order. This narrative was politically essential. It justified everything the Meiji government had done for 45 years, and it required maintaining a clear separation between the imperial family and the Tokugawa bloodline. Any suggestion that the two families had reconciled, intermarried, or most dangerously, that someone of Tokugawa descent had been absorbed into the imperial household, would undermine the foundational mythology of modern Japan. Tanaka and his allies had spent decades ensuring that such a suggestion could never be made. They had carefully managed imperial genealogies. They had controlled access to family records. They had ensured that the official history of the Meiji era remained pristine. And then someone had walked into the most formal photograph of 1912, wearing the Tokugawa crest woven into her imperial robe. For Tanaka, this wasn't just a protocol violation. It was an existential threat to the narrative he had spent his career protecting. In 2021, the Tokugawa Memorial Foundation acquired a collection of private letters that had been held by a family descended from Tokugawa household retainers. Among the correspondence was a series of letters from the 1890s discussing what the writers called bridge-building arrangements, marriages between the two great houses that would heal the divisions of the Restoration. One letter dated 1897 from a woman identified only as Aunt Masa discusses the birth of a daughter to a niece who had recently married, a gentleman of the Fushimi house. The letter notes, "The child is healthy and beautiful. She carries the blood of both houses now, as was intended. May she be a bridge between what was and what will be. I pray she is never made to choose between her two inheritances." The Fushimi house, Prince Fushimi Sadanaru's extended family, the same household that had commissioned the mysterious robe from the Kawashima Textile workshop. If a daughter had been born in 1897 to a union between a Fushimi prince and a woman of Tokugawa descent, she would have been approximately 15 years old in 1912, perhaps slightly younger than she appeared in the photograph, but within the range of plausibility given formal styling and cosmetics. The phrase, "never made to choose between her two inheritances," took on new meaning when viewed alongside a robe that deliberately displayed both. The imperial chrysanthemum and the Tokugawa hollyhock, woven together in a single garment. To understand why a pattern woven into silk could be politically dangerous, you need to understand what was at stake in 1912. Japan had just fought 2 major wars, against China in 1895, against Russia in 1905, and emerged as a global power. The nation was negotiating its place in the international order, and the imperial institution was central to Japan's claim to equal status with Western nations. The Meiji government had constructed an elaborate mythology around the imperial family. The emperor was divine, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu in an unbroken line stretching back 2,600 years. This mythology had been weaponized to justify the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate, to centralize power, and to demand unquestioning loyalty from the population. Any suggestion that the imperial family and the Tokugawa family had merged, that the blood of the usurpers now flowed in imperial veins, would undermine this mythology at its foundation. It would suggest that the Meiji Restoration had been not a divine restoration of rightful rule, but merely one political faction replacing another. For officials like Tanaka Mitsuaki, protecting imperial purity wasn't just about tradition. It was about maintaining the ideological foundations of the Japanese state. A woman wearing Tokugawa symbols in an imperial photograph wasn't making a fashion statement. She was, whether intentionally or not, exposing a truth that could shake the foundations of the modern Japanese nation. Stay with me. By minute 15, you'll understand exactly why this woman was erased from history, and you'll see the document that was created to justify her disappearance. What the Imperial Household Agency did to her wasn't just censorship. It was the systematic erasure of a human being from official existence. And the methods they used are documented in archives that were sealed for over a century. The Meiji government had established precedents for dealing with those who violated imperial protocols. In 1878, a court lady who had formed an unauthorized relationship with a member of the Imperial Guard was dismissed and exiled to her family's rural estate. She died in obscurity 3 years later. In 1891, a prince who had married without permission was forced to divorce and stripped of his allowance. In 1910, a group of accused anarchists were executed for allegedly plotting against the emperor, several of them almost certainly innocent. The Meiji state did not tolerate challenges to its authority, especially challenges that touched on the sanctity of the imperial institution. For a woman who had worn the symbols of both the imperial family and the Tokugawa bloodline, a woman whose very existence might suggest that the two families had merged, the consequences could range from quiet erasure to something far worse. In Japanese elite society of the period, the concept of responsibility for bringing shame upon one's family often pointed in one direction: towards self-destruction. If the woman in the photograph had been identified as a threat to imperial legitimacy, the pressure on her would have been immense, and the options available to her would have been almost non-existent. Researchers began compiling every known photograph from 1912 and 1913 that included members of the extended imperial family. The pattern they found was systematic. March 1912, the formal portrait with the forbidden symbol, she is visible. July 1912, Emperor Meiji's funeral procession. She appears in one group photograph positioned at the edge. September 1912, Emperor Taisho's enthronement ceremony. She is absent from all photographs. November 1912, New Year preparation ceremonies at the Imperial Palace. She is absent. By early 1913, she has vanished completely from the photographic record. The final confirmation came from a household registry document recovered from the Fushimi family's private archive, a document that was never supposed to be seen outside the family. Dated December 1913, it records the voluntary withdrawal of a female household member from imperial household roles, citing health concerns. The name recorded is not Kazuko but Yashiko, but the age and description match. More significantly, the document bears the seal of Tanaka Mitsuaki's office. She hadn't died. She hadn't been exiled in any official sense. She had simply ceased to exist in imperial records. Her name was gone, her photographs were withdrawn, her presence in the historical record was systematically erased. But the photograph that had started it all, the one marked for safekeeping, that one had survived. To understand why the Imperial Household Agency saw this woman as such a threat, we needed to understand who she actually was. The 1897 letter from Aunt Masa had mentioned a marriage between a gentleman of the Fushimi house and a woman of Tokugawa descent. But the Tokugawa family in 2020 is not a monolithic institution. It's a dispersed collection of branch families, memorial associations, and private households, each with their own archives and their own sensitivities about historical research. Dr. Yamamoto's team spent 8 months requesting access to various collections. Most were denied. The main Tokugawa Memorial Foundation maintained strict protocols about protecting family privacy. Branch family representatives declined to participate. Doors that had been open for other research projects suddenly closed. But one small collection, held by a regional museum in Shizuoka Prefecture, the historic seat of Tokugawa power, agreed to allow limited research. The collection had been donated by an elderly woman in 1989 and had never been fully catalogued. Among the documents were letters, diaries, and photographs from a family that had been minor retainers of the Tokugawa household. In a box labeled Family Correspondence Meiji Era, Dr. Yamamoto found what he was looking for. The letters span from 1894 to 1911, written by and to a woman named Masako, likely the same Aunt Masa from the 1897 letter. Masako appears to have been a confidant and protector for the younger woman who would eventually wear the forbidden robe. In a letter from 1905, when the younger woman would have been approximately 8 years old, Masako writes, "She asks constantly about her father's family. She has heard the stories of the great shoguns and she wants to know if she is connected to them. I told her the truth, that she carries the blood of both the chrysanthemum and the hollyhock. She asked if that made her special or strange. I told her it made her a bridge." A bridge, the same word that appeared in the 1897 letter. A letter from 1909 shows the young woman beginning to assert her own identity. "She has been studying the family crests with great intensity. She told me she wants to have a robe made that shows both the chrysanthemum for her father's house and the hollyhock for her mother's people. I told her this would be dangerous. She said, 'If I cannot speak my truth, I will wear it.' The determination in her eyes frightened me. 'If I cannot speak my truth, I will wear it.' The words of a teenager planning an act of quiet defiance. An act that would take over a century to discover. The most difficult letter in the collection is dated March 1897, the month of the young woman's birth. It is written by Masako to an unnamed recipient, and it tells a story that explains everything that would come after. The child was born last night, a girl healthy and beautiful. Her mother wept with relief when she heard the first cry, but the relief is tempered by grief. The father has been forbidden to acknowledge her. His family has demanded silence. The marriage, such as it was, has been erased from records. The mother will be sent to the country with a small allowance and instructions never to speak of what happened. I have promised to watch over the child. She will be raised in the household of the Fushimi princes, but she will not be acknowledged as blood. She will be a shadow present but never named. I pray that someday she will be able to step into the light. But I fear what will happen if she tries. A child born of a forbidden union between the two great houses of Japanese history. Raised in the shadow of the imperial court. Never fully acknowledged. Always aware of the truth she was forbidden to speak. And then, in 1912, she found a way to speak it anyway. Not with words, but with silk and thread and the ancient language of family symbols. Masako was not the only protector. The letters reveal a network of people within the Fushimi household and connected families who knew the young woman's true identity and worked to shelter her. A senior lady-in-waiting who ensured she received proper education. A cousin who advocated for her inclusion in family events. A textile master who was trusted to create the forbidden robe. Prince Fushimi Sadanaru himself appears to have been aware of the situation. A letter from 1911, the year the robe was commissioned, mentions that His Highness has approved the Textile Commission with full knowledge of what it represents. He believes reconciliation is inevitable and that history will judge this moment favorably. Prince Fushimi was betting that the era of strict separation between the imperial family and the Tokugawa bloodline was ending. He believed that within a generation, marriages between the houses would be openly acknowledged. Children like this young woman would take their rightful place in the imperial family. He was wrong about the timing. The forces of reaction were stronger than he anticipated. And when Emperor Meiji died in July 1912, the advocates of reconciliation lost their most important protector. Emperor Meiji died on July 30, 1912. Within 2 weeks, Tanaka Mitsuaki and his allies had initiated the Photographic Protocol Review. Within 6 months, they had identified the young woman as a threat. Within a year, they had erased her from Imperial records. The protection network tried to delay the process. Letters show Masako pleading with household officials for more time. Prince Fushimi argued that the young woman's removal would itself create scandal if discovered. But the political winds had shifted. Emperor Taisho was weak, suffering from what modern historians believe was neurological illness. Power was consolidating around conservative bureaucrats who saw any deviation from protocol as a threat. A final letter from Masako, dated October 1913, shows the end of hope. They have made their decision. She is to be removed from the household roles. She will retain a small allowance and residence within the compound, but she will never again appear in photographs or at ceremonies. Her children, if she has any, will not be acknowledged. Her name will be forgotten. She received the news with dignity. She said only, "At least I was seen once, at least the photograph exists." She doesn't know that they are withdrawing it. I haven't the heart to tell her. But someone had saved one copy. Someone had marked it for safekeeping. And 107 years later, it would be found. By the end of 1913, she had been erased. Her name removed from records, her photographs withdrawn, her existence made invisible. The Imperial Household Agency had accomplished what it set out to do: protect the mythology of imperial purity by eliminating any evidence that the blood of both houses flowed in the same veins. But erasure is not destruction. The photograph survived. The textile fragment survived. And the woman herself, the woman who had said, "If I cannot speak my truth, I will wear it," she survived too. Not in the light of imperial ceremonies, but in the shadows of the palace compound where she had always lived. What happened to her during the decades that followed? And did she ever find a way to reclaim the identity that had been taken from her? The erasure of 1913 did not mean exile. It did not mean death. What it meant was something perhaps more painful, a life lived in the spaces between official existence. The young woman who had worn the forbidden symbol was permitted to remain within the Fushimi household compound. She was assigned a small residence at the eastern edge of the estate. A cottage, really. 2 rooms, a small garden, a view of nothing but walls. She was given servants, 2 elderly women who had known her since childhood and who would remain loyal until their deaths. She received a monthly allowance sufficient for modest comfort, but she was forbidden from appearing at any public ceremony, any formal photograph, any event where her presence might be documented. She became what the Japanese language calls a kage no hito, a person of shadows, present but unseen, alive but unrecorded, breathing the same air as the imperial family, walking the same grounds but invisible to history. Scattered references in household account books show her continued existence through the 1910s and 1920s. An entry for supplementary household provisions delivered to her residence. A notation about medical expenses for the lady of the Eastern cottage. A requisition for mourning garments in 1926, when Emperor Taisho died, suggesting she was still considered enough of a household member to observe formal mourning, even if she could not appear at the funeral. But the most revealing reference came from an unexpected source: the diary of a junior maid who served in the Fushimi household from 1918 to 1924. Chiyo Yamamoto was 16 years old when she entered service in the Fushimi household in 1918. She kept a small diary hidden among her personal belongings, recording observations about her daily life. The diary was discovered in 2017 by her granddaughter while clearing the family home after Chiyo's death at age 115. Most entries concern the mundane details of household work, but scattered throughout are careful references to a woman Chiyo calls only the Lady of the East. An entry from March 1919. Today I was assigned to deliver provisions to the Eastern cottage. The lady received me at the door herself, unusual, as she normally has her attendants handle such things. She is not at all what I expected. Her bearing is noble, her manner gracious. She thanked me by name and asked about my family. When I told her my father had served in the Russo-Japanese War, she said, Then your family has given much to this country. I hope you know how valuable you are. No one in the main household has ever spoken to me with such kindness. Another entry from November 1921. The lady asked me to bring her books from the main library. She wanted histories, specifically histories of the Tokugawa period. I did not ask why. When I returned with the books, I saw that she was working on something at her writing desk, fabric of some kind with colored threads. She covered it quickly when I entered. I pretended not to notice. Fabric with colored threads. Even in isolation, even after everything had been taken from her, she was still working with textiles, still weaving, still encoding her truth into silk. Chiyo's observation about fabric and colored threads was not isolated. Other references in household documents suggest that the lady of the East spent much of her time engaged in textile work, an appropriate activity for a woman of her class, and one that apparently raised no suspicion. But what was she making? In 1987, the Kyoto National Museum received a donation from an elderly woman who identified herself only as a member of a family connected to the imperial household. The donation included a collection of small textile objects, fukusa gift cloths, obi accessories, and decorative panels, dating from the early 20th century. The donor refused to provide provenance information. She said only, "These were made by someone who could not speak her name. I hope someday someone will understand their meaning." The collection was catalogued and stored. For decades, no one examined it closely. In 2020, following the discovery of the forbidden symbol in the 1912 photograph, textile historian Dr. Yuki Tanaka requested access to the 1987 donation. What she found confirmed her suspicion. Every piece in the collection contained variations of the same motif: the 14-petal chrysanthemum, the 3-leafed Tokugawa hollyhock, intertwined in pattern after pattern after pattern. Some were subtle, hidden within larger designs. Others were more prominent, woven boldly into the fabric's center. But all of them carried the same message, the same declaration of dual identity that had appeared on the 1912 robe. Someone had spent decades creating these objects. Someone had ensured they survived. And someone had donated them anonymously, knowing that someday someone would finally understand. If you're still watching, you already understand what she survived: the erasure, the isolation, the decades of invisible existence within walls that had once been her home. What you don't know yet is whether her story ends in tragedy or something else. Stay with me. In the next few minutes, you'll discover what became of her, and you'll meet someone who believes they are her living descendant. One of the most surprising discoveries came from a completely unexpected source: municipal birth records from Kamakura, a coastal city south of Tokyo. In 1923, following the Great Kanto earthquake that devastated Tokyo and killed over 100,000 people, the Fushimi household temporarily relocated to a villa in Kamakura. Among the birth records from the city registry for 1924 was an entry that made researchers pause. A child named Haruki, born to a mother listed as Yashiko, no family name registered, resident of Fushimi Villa, and a father named Kenji Nakamura, scholar. Yashiko, the same name that appeared on the 1913 household registry when she was removed from imperial rolls. The birth record indicates that this was not a first child. The notation, second birth, appears in the margin. Somewhere there was another child born before 1924 whose birth record has never been located. A marriage record has never been found. The union was almost certainly informal, conducted privately without official recognition. But the birth record proves something remarkable. She had not spent her decades of isolation entirely alone. Someone had entered her life. Someone had loved her despite everything. Someone had given her a family. And that family had continued into a new generation. The 1930s and 1940s were catastrophic for Japan. The rise of militarism, the invasion of China, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the firebombings that reduced Tokyo to ash, the atomic bombs, the defeat, the occupation. For everyone in Japan, these decades brought unimaginable suffering. For the woman who had been erased, these years also brought a kind of obscurity that may have ultimately protected her. As the imperial institution became increasingly militarized and controlled, attention focused on active members of the imperial family. Someone who had been invisible for decades would have been beneath notice. The last reference to her in any document comes from a Fushimi household ledger entry in late 1944. Provisions suspended for Eastern Cottage, resident deceased. No cause of death, no funeral record, no acknowledgement that someone who had once stood in the Imperial family portrait had passed from the world. She would have been in her late 40s, young by modern standards, but not unusual for a time when Tokyo was burning and supplies were scarce. Whether she died of illness, malnutrition, or simply the exhaustion of a life lived in shadow, we will never know. But her children survived. The 1924 birth record for Haruki was the beginning of a thread that researchers would eventually follow. Through the chaos of the post-war era, through the transformation of Japanese society, and into the present day. She had been erased, but she had also endured. And the truth she had woven into silk had outlasted her silencing. Following Japan's surrender in August 1945, the American occupation fundamentally transformed the imperial institution. The emperor renounced his divine status. Cadet branches of the imperial family, including the Fushimi house, were removed from imperial status and forced to become commoners. Property was confiscated. Archives were scattered or destroyed. For researchers trying to trace the descendants of the mystery woman, these changes created an almost impossible obstacle. Household registries that might have documented her children's lives were lost. The Fushimi family's private archives were partially destroyed during the Tokyo firebombings and further dispersed when the family lost its property after the war. The trail of Haruki, the child born in Kamakura in 1924, went cold. The name Nakamura was among the most common surnames in Japan. Without more specific information, identifying the right family among millions was impossible. For 2 years, researchers hit dead end after dead end. Census records from the 1950s showed dozens of Haruki Nakamuras of the right age. None could be definitively connected to the mystery woman. The investigation appeared to have reached its limit, until a researcher thought to look in a completely unexpected place. In late 2021, Dr. Tanaka was reviewing the accession file for the 1987 textile donation when she noticed something that had been overlooked. The donation form required a return address, standard procedure in case the museum needed to contact the donor about conservation or display questions. The donor had provided an address, a residential building in Kyoto's Higashiyama district. The address still existed. The building was an apartment complex constructed in the 1970s. Resident records were private, but Dr. Tanaka reached out through academic channels to colleagues at Kyoto University who had connections in the neighborhood. Within 2 weeks, she had a name. Sachiko Murata, a woman in her 80s who had lived in the building since 1976 and who was known in the neighborhood as someone with an interest in traditional textiles. Sachiko had died in 2019, but her daughter, Yumiko Murata, still lived in Kyoto. Dr. Tanaka wrote a careful letter explaining her research and asking if Yumiko would be willing to meet. The response came 3 weeks later. "I have waited my entire life for someone to ask about my grandmother's grandmother. Please come to Kyoto. I have something to show you." Grandmother's grandmother. If Yumiko Murata was in her 50s or 60s, her grandmother would have been born in the 1920s or 1930s. Her grandmother's grandmother would have been born in the 1890s. Exactly the right time frame for the woman in the photograph. Dr. Tanaka traveled to Kyoto in January 2022. Yumiko Murata received her in a traditional tea room in her modest apartment, a room whose walls were decorated with framed textile pieces that Dr. Tanaka immediately recognized as similar to the 1987 donation. "My mother told me this story when I was 20 years old," Yumiko said. "She told me that I must never repeat it outside the family because there were still people who would want to silence us. But she also said that someday someone would come asking, and when they did, I should tell them everything." Yumiko produced a wooden box that had been kept in her family for 4 generations. Inside was a collection of documents and photographs. The first item was a photograph, a formal portrait from what appeared to be the early Showa era, showing a woman in her 30s with 2 young children. On the back was written, "Yashiko with Haruki and Tamo, Kamakura, 1930. Yashiko, the same name on the 1913 registry. the same name on the 1924 birth record. That is my grandmother's grandmother, Yumiko said quietly. We called her Obasama no Obasama, the great-great-grandmother. My mother never met her, but she was told about her all her life. She was told that Obasama no Obasama was connected to both the Imperial family and the Tokugawa shoguns. She was told that her existence was erased because of what she represented, and she was told that someday the truth would be known. Beneath the photograph was something else, something that made Dr. Tanaka's hands begin to tremble. What Dr. Tanaka saw beneath the photograph was a fragment of silk fabric, approximately 15 centimeters square, carefully preserved between layers of acid-free paper. The silk was old, visibly aged, but still showing traces of the deep purple-black color called koki murasaki. And woven into the fabric was a pattern that Dr. Tanaka had only ever seen in a digitally enhanced photograph. The 14-petal chrysanthemum, the 3-leafed Tokugawa hollyhock, intertwined exactly as they appeared in the 1912 portrait. Obasama no Obasama kept this piece, Yumiko explained. She cut it from her robe before they could take it from her. She said it was proof of who she was. She said that as long as this fabric existed, her truth could not be completely erased. She gave it to her daughter, who gave it to my grandmother, who gave it to my mother, who gave it to me. Dr. Tanaka asked for permission to photograph the fragment and compare it to the enhanced image from the 1912 photograph. The match was exact. Thread count, weave pattern, color values adjusted for aging, every element aligned perfectly. I've been waiting 60 years to show this to someone who would understand, Yumiko said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with emotion. Is she finally going to be remembered? For over a century, the woman in the photograph had been erased, her name removed from records, her face withdrawn from archives, her existence denied by the institution that should have protected her. But her family had kept her truth alive. And now, 110 years after that photograph was taken, the evidence had finally come together. In the box was one more item, a cassette tape labeled in careful handwriting, "For the family, 1986. My mother made this recording when she was 70 years old, Yumiko said. She wanted to make sure the story was preserved exactly as it was told to her. She recited everything she remembered. I have listened to it many times. Yumiko pressed play. The voice of Sachiko Murata, speaking from nearly 40 years in the past, filled the small room. My grandmother, Yashiko, who we called Obasama, told my mother that she was born in 1897 to a father of the Fushimi Imperial House and a mother who was descended from the Tokugawa shoguns. She was raised in shadow, never acknowledged, always aware of what she was and what she could never be. The recording continued, Sachiko's voice careful and precise. When she was young, she decided that if she could not speak her truth, she would wear it. She had a robe made that carried the symbols of both her bloodlines, and she wore it into the Imperial Palace for a formal photograph in the spring of 1912. A pause on the tape, then Sachiko's voice again, softer now. She said that when she walked into that room wearing that robe, she knew she might be punished. She knew she might be killed, but she said, I would rather die as myself than live as no one. Those were her words. I would rather die as myself than live as no one. The tape continued for another 40 minutes, recounting the details of Yashiko's life in shadow, her marriage, her children, her death during the war. But it was those words that echoed in the silence after the tape ended. I would rather die as myself than live as no one. A woman had chosen identity over safety, truth over survival, and her choice, preserved through 4 generations of careful telling, had finally reached the world. I would rather die as myself than live as no one. Yashiko had spoken those words over a century ago, and now, finally, someone had heard them. She had survived the erasure, not in official records, not in the histories written by those who had silenced her, but in the memories of her descendants, in the fabric she had woven, in the photograph that had been preserved against all odds. But the story doesn't end with her survival. What happened to the people who had tried to erase her? What became of the officials who had ordered her photographs withdrawn? And what does Yashiko's great-great-granddaughter hope will happen now that the truth is finally known? Tanaka Mitsuaki, the official who had ordered the photographic review and overseen Yashiko's erasure, continued to accumulate power through the 1910s. By 1919, He was one of the most influential figures in the imperial household ministry, shaping how the imperial family was presented to the public and the world. But the Taisho era brought changes he had not anticipated. Emperor Taisho's illness created a power vacuum. Liberal democratic movements challenged the authoritarian structures Tanaka had helped build. Young princes and princesses chafed at the rigid protocols that men like Tanaka enforced. In 1921, Tanaka was quietly removed from his position. The official explanation was health concerns, but internal documents from the period, declassified in 2005, reveal that he had been accused of excessive interference in private family matters and creating unnecessary conflicts within the household. His rigid approach to imperial image control had made enemies even among conservatives who agreed with his goals. Tanaka retired to his family estate in Kagoshima Prefecture, where he lived in increasingly bitter isolation until his death in 1934. His memoirs, published posthumously, reveal a man convinced that his work had been essential and baffled by his fall from grace. "I gave my life to preserving the purity of the imperial image," he wrote, "and I was punished for it by those who benefited most from my efforts." He never mentioned Yoshiko by name. He never acknowledged what he had done to her. But the patterns he had tried to hide, the symbols woven into silk, outlasted him by nearly a century. The imperial mythology that Tanaka and his allies had fought to protect, the myth of divine lineage, unbroken purity, separation from the corrupted Tokugawa era, became the foundation of the wartime imperial cult that drove Japan toward catastrophe. The emperor was divine, his authority was absolute, his image was sacred. These beliefs, carefully constructed and ruthlessly enforced, led a nation to war, to atrocity, to defeat, to devastation. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke directly to the Japanese people for the first time, announcing Japan's surrender. On January 1, 1946, he renounced his divine status in the Declaration of Humanity. The mythology that had required Yoshiko's erasure was officially dismantled. The irony is profound. Tanaka Mitsuaki and his allies had erased Yoshiko to protect a story of imperial purity. That story became the justification for a war that killed millions, and when the war ended, the story was abandoned anyway. If the officials who erased Yoshiko in 1913 could have seen what their mythology would lead to, would they have made different choices? There is no way to know. But history's verdict is clear. The mythology failed. The institution it was meant to protect survived only by abandoning everything those men had fought to preserve. And Yoshiko's truth, the truth that the chrysanthemum and the hollyhock could coexist, had always been more honest about the complexity of Japanese history than the simplified mythology her erasers promoted. When Yumiko Murata was asked what she knew about the men who had erased her ancestor, she said something unexpected. "My mother researched them. She wanted to know who they were, what became of them. She found that Tanaka Mitsuaki's line died out in the 1970s, no surviving descendants. The other officials who signed the memorandum had similar fates. Their families scattered, diminished, forgotten." Yumiko paused, then continued. "Meanwhile, Obasama's line continued. She had 2 children. Those children had 5 grandchildren. Those grandchildren had 11 great-grandchildren. I have 2 daughters and a son. My sister has 3 children. We are still here. We remember her." The officials who had tried to erase Yoshiko believed they were protecting something permanent. But the imperial system they defended was transformed beyond recognition. The mythology they upheld was abandoned. Their own family lines ended. And the woman they tried to make invisible, she became the ancestor of a family that spans generations. "They thought they could erase her," Yumiko said quietly. "But you cannot erase someone who is loved. You cannot erase someone whose truth is passed from grandmother to granddaughter, generation after generation. They made her invisible to history, but she was always visible to us." Consider the contrast. Tanaka Mitsuaki, powerful in 1912, removed from office in 1921, died in bitterness in 1934, no surviving descendants, remembered only as a footnote in bureaucratic history. Yoshiko, erased in 1913, lived in shadow for 3 decades, died unmarked in 1944. But her children survived, her truth survived, her textile fragment survived, her photograph survived. And today, researchers, historians, and the public are finally learning her name. The men who tried to erase Yoshiko believed that power could control truth, that institutions could define reality, that if they removed someone from the record, she would cease to exist. They were wrong. Yoshiko understood something they did not. Truth has a way of surviving. It can be woven into silk. It can be passed from grandmother to granddaughter. It can wait for a century until someone is finally ready to listen. The erasers are gone. Yoshiko endures. And after 110 years of silence, her truth is finally being spoken. Yumiko Murata is 58 years old. She has spent her career at the Kyoto National Museum as a textile preservation specialist, a path she chose deliberately, knowing that textiles had been the language her ancestor used to speak her truth. I never told my colleagues why I was interested in this work, Yumiko says. I just said that textiles fascinated me, the history woven into every thread, the stories that fabric can tell when words are forbidden. They had no idea that I was searching every archive, every collection for any trace of Obasama no Obasama. For 40 years, Yumiko conducted her own quiet investigation. She researched imperial textile protocols. She studied chrysanthemum crest variations. She learned everything she could about the Tokugawa hollyhock and its prohibition after the Meiji Restoration. She became one of Japan's leading experts on Meiji-era ceremonial textiles, all while never revealing why she cared so deeply. When Dr. Tanaka contacted me about the 1987 donation, Yumiko says, I was not surprised. I had been waiting. I had spent my whole life preparing for the moment when someone would finally ask the right questions, and when the moment came, I was ready. The granddaughter had become a guardian. The secret had become her life's work. And the truth that had been woven into silk in 1912 had found its keeper. The collection that Yumiko Murata guards includes items from every generation. From Yoshiko herself, the textile fragment cut from the 1912 robe, a small collection of her later textile works, a few personal photographs from the 1920s and 1930s. From her daughter Haruki, letters describing her mother's life in shadow, written in the 1960s when Haruki was in her 40s, photographs of the family during the early Showa era. From her granddaughter Sachiko, the 1986 audio recording, additional textile donations made anonymously to various museums, written notes expanding on the oral history. From Yumiko herself, decades of research files, photographs documenting the family line, careful preservation of everything that came before. Each generation was told, "This is your responsibility now," Yumiko explains. "You must keep these items safe. You must remember the story exactly as it was told to you. And you must pass it on. Someday someone will come asking. When they do, you must be ready to tell them everything." For 4 generations, the women of this family had been archivists of their own erasure. They had maintained what the institution had tried to destroy. And when the moment finally came, they had everything they needed to prove the truth. When asked what she hopes will happen now that the research is becoming public, Yumiko's answer is measured. "I do not want revenge. The men who erased Obasama no Obasama have been dead for many decades. I do not want to embarrass the Imperial family. They have their own relationship to their history, and I respect that." She pauses, choosing her words carefully. "What I want is acknowledgement. I want historians to know that there was a woman named Yoshiko who was erased from the records. I want textile scholars to understand that the symbols woven into her robe were deliberate, a statement of identity, not an accident. I want people who study the Meiji era to understand that the story was more complicated than the official version." Her voice softens. "And I want my great-great-grandmother to be remembered, not as a scandal, not as a problem that had to be solved, but as a woman who had the courage to wear her truth when she was forbidden to speak it." Yumiko pauses, then adds, She said, "I would rather die as myself than live as no one." I want the world to know that she did die as herself, and that she was always someone to us. She was always someone. Now, finally, she can be someone to everyone. Yumiko has 2 daughters, Akiko, 29, and Miki, 26. Both were told the family story when they turned 20, the same age at which the story has been passed down for generations. When my mother told me about Obasama no Obasama, Akiko says, I cried, not because it was sad, although it is sad. I cried because I realized how lucky I was. I know who I am. I know where I come from. I carry the blood of the chrysanthemum and the hollyhock, and I am proud of both. Mickey adds, I always wondered why my mother was so interested in old textiles. Now I understand. She was looking for her grandmother's grandmother. She was looking for proof of what our family already knew, and she found it. The daughters have begun to tell the story themselves, carefully, among trusted friends, in spaces where they feel safe. They know that the truth is emerging, that researchers and historians are finally asking questions. They are ready to be part of the answer. We are the fifth generation, Akiko says, but we don't think of ourselves as the end of the story. We are just the next chapter. Obasama no Obasama started something when she wore that robe. We are going to make sure it continues. In the 1912 photograph, a young woman stands at the edge of the Imperial family, wearing a truth that would take a century to notice. In a Kyoto apartment in 2022, her great-great-great-granddaughters hold the silk fragment she preserved, ready to carry her story forward. The erasure had lasted 110 years. It is finally ending. Look at the photograph one more time. Emperor Meiji sits at the center, his health failing, his era ending. Empress Shokan beside him, embodying the formal dignity expected of an imperial consort. Crown Prince Yashihito, who would become the troubled Emperor Taisho. The princes and princesses arrayed around them, positioned according to rank and precedence. And there, at the left edge of the frame, Yashiko. 23 years old, her face composed in the manner required by imperial photography, her posture perfect, her hands folded. But look closer. Look at her eyes. There is something there, not defiance exactly, not anger, something quieter. Determination, perhaps. The knowledge that she is doing something dangerous, something that could destroy her, but doing it anyway. Look at her robe. At the obi sash where the 14-petaled chrysanthemum winds through silk. At the lower hem where the Tokugawa hollyhock emerges from shadow. She wore her truth into the most formal occasion of the Meiji era. She stood feet from the emperor and declared, in the only language she was permitted to use, who she truly was. For 111 years, no one noticed. The photograph was withdrawn, her name was erased, her existence was denied. But she had made her statement, she had woven her truth into silk. And eventually, finally, someone saw it. This story is about many things. It is about imperial politics and textile symbolism and the digital technology that can reveal what was hidden. But at its core, it is about something simpler. It is about a woman who was forbidden to speak her truth and found a way to wear it instead. It is about a family that was erased from official history and survived in the memories and dedication of daughters and granddaughters. It is about the difference between official records and actual truth, and how the second can outlast the first by generations. And it is about this. Power can erase, institutions can silence, records can be withdrawn, names can be removed. But truth has a way of persisting. It can be woven into silk. It can be whispered from grandmother to granddaughter. It can wait for 100 years until someone is finally ready to see it. Yashiko understood this. When she walked into the Imperial Palace in the spring of 1912, wearing the symbols of her two bloodlines, she was not just making a statement for that moment. She was sending a message to the future. She was betting that someday, someone would see what she had done. And she was right. 111 years later, we finally see her. We finally know her name. We finally understand what she chose and what it cost her and why it mattered. The erasure is over. Yashiko exists again. In the 1912 photograph, there is a woman standing at the edge of the frame. For over a century, no one knew her name. No one understood what she wore. No one heard what she was trying to say. But she was patient. She wove her truth into silk. She trusted that someday, someone would look closely enough to see it. Her name was Yashiko. She was the daughter of two houses that were supposed to be enemies. She was erased for revealing a truth that powerful men wanted to hide. And she was loved by her protectors, by her husband, by her children, by her grandchildren, and by the great-great-granddaughters who kept her story alive for 4 generations. She said, "I would rather die as myself than live as no one." She died as herself. And now, finally, she lives again. Not as no one, but as exactly who she was. A bridge between two houses, a truth woven into silk, a woman who refused to be erased. Yashiko, finally seen, finally known, finally remembered. If you found this story meaningful, I hope you'll share it with someone who values hidden histories and the truths that survive against all odds. Every photograph contains stories we haven't yet discovered. Every family holds memories that deserve to be heard. If you have photographs in your own family that contain mysteries you've never understood, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. And if you want to learn more about Japanese imperial history, textile symbolism, or other hidden stories in historical photographs, there's a video right here that I think you'll find fascinating. Thank you for staying with me for this journey. Yashiko waited 111 years for someone to see her truth. Thank you for being part of the generation that finally did.